The topic that our team will be proposing is trade barriers damage relationships between countries. Imagine yourself as the government of a big country, let's say the USA. If you were to impose a trade barrier on another country, do you think it would lead to the damaging our relationships with them? Well, we, the affirmative team, believe that this statement is true. In this debate, our team will be focusing on why trade barriers are detrimental to relations between countries and how relations among countries are affected if trade barriers are imposed. Some of the trade barriers that we will be sharing include tariffs, import quotas, embargo, and the beggar-tie neighbor policy. In today's debate, we'll be talking about three main points. First, trade barriers will affect the economy, which will lead to unhappiness. Trade barriers will lead to retaliation, leading to trade war. Lastly, trade barriers will affect innocent countries. As countries place trade barriers on others, they risk damaging relations with them. Hence, our team agrees that trade barriers damage relationships between countries. For the first point, trade barriers affect the exchange rate currency of countries. Trade barriers such as tariffs and import quotas affect the exchange rate of currencies between countries. This will lead to an economic downturn for the rival country and cause relationships between the two nations to worsen. For instance, when the United States increases its import tariffs or puts a lower import quota on Japanese steel, the demand for American steel would rise as the prices of Japanese steel would be unfavorable to consumers. Thus, the US dollar will appreciate as dollars are diverted from the foreign exchange market to its domestic currency. As such, increasing trade barriers would allow the country's currency to appreciate in the long run. However, this would cause a lot of unhappiness in the rival country, and thus create escalated tensions between both countries.
The next point will be on how tariffs can affect the economy on both sides. Tariffs will lead to a loss of economic welfare as the prices of goods are higher and consumers' choices are limited. Consumers will then have to spend more as goods will have higher import duties, and this will cause them to spend less as the value of their disposable income becomes smaller. This can also lead to an inefficient allocation of resources where jobs are lost in other industries. Tariffs will also reduce the average level of wages in the country as the output that an economy can produce is limited. In addition, due to a decrease in demand for foreign goods, which is resulted by the lower prices of domestically produced goods, the competitors' economy would decline as it would experience an increase in unemployment. For example, the US and China have been in a trade war for over 2 years since the start of 2018, with both parties imposing tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of one another's goods. In January 2018, the US announced that they will be imposing tariffs on China-made washing machines and solar cells. According to the Tax Foundation model, the tariffs imposed by the US at that time have reduced long-term GDP by 23%, or approximately $58 billion. Wages have also been reduced by 0.15% and an estimated loss of 180,000 jobs. China, who is the second largest economy in the world, has also suffered as economic growth is at its lowest pace since the trade war. This slowdown in economic growth has thus increased the unemployment rate, where an estimated job loss of 1.3 million to 1.9 million occurred due to the rise in US tariffs. This proves the detrimental impact that countries may experience with trade barriers implemented, as there will be a decrease in the income of households and eventually the purchasing power of consumers. This will negatively affect the economic activities in many countries as the economic output is lowered. Hence, countries will be unhappy about their badly affected economies, and this will definitely damage the relationships that countries have with one another.
Import quotas are limits on the amount of imports that can be brought into a country and can affect the price of an item. The enforcement of import quotas restrains the availability of foreign goods or services in the domestic country, causing shortages which leads to a rise in the prices. This will lead to a decrease in demand for the foreign goods or services as consumers would rather pay for the cheaper and domestically produced alternatives. For example, in the late 2006, South Africa imposed quotas on transportations of clothing and textiles from China. This resulted the Chinese imports in the textile or clothing lines to decline by 50%, Rand 4.2 million to Rand 2.1 million. This caused the Chinese market share in quota lines to decline by 26%. Thus, import quotas will cause a downturn for the competitor's economy, especially if the demand of its goods is elastic, not homogeneous, and widely rely on exports, as their revenue will greatly decrease, which damage relationship between countries. Embargo is an example of a non-tariff trade barrier which can damage relationships countries have with one another. A trade embargo is the most direct barrier to trade and is also capable of causing a major strain on a country's economy. By imposing an embargo on a country, trade and business activities are restricted and forces the country's economy to collapse. As a result, trade relations between the countries will be damaged. An example would be the embargoes imposed on Cuba by the US. The US first established it on October 1960. Diplomatic relations between the two countries were severed. This led to further escalated tensions between the two countries. According to estimates by the Cuban government, these trade embargoes by the US have led Cuba to a loss of approximately 1.126 trillion over the next 5 decades.
Such as anti-dumping will damage relationship between countries as they set price lower than any local company could offer on the domestic market. A country prevent dumping through trade agreement. If one country decided to violate the agreement, the other may impose trade restriction and tariff to counterattack dumping, and this could lead to trade war. For example, EU has placed many anti-dumping measures on China to protect its market from their relative cheap products such as steel. Trade relations between EU and China will further worsen as the EU imposed new anti-dumping policy on China. This shows that anti-dumping can result in erosion of foreign relation among countries. Next point will be how backward neighbour brings about trade war. Backward neighbour is a term used for a series of policies that are introduced as a country to tackle its economic challenges. This end up negatively impact its neighbour or trading partner. Backward neighbour is a solution for domestic depression and high unemployment rate. By increasing the demand of nation export, it reduces the reliance on import. In order to lower the price of export, this means an increase in demand of domestic goods will lead to an implementation of some kind of trade barriers. An example would be currency war. In order to stimulate their economy, nations will intentionally lower the value of their national currency. Other countries can have an effect without consideration.
Trade barriers damage relationships as it leads to retaliation. When a trade barrier is imposed by a country, it might create tension. A trade barrier is usually implemented to protect the local economy by raising the cost of imports, encouraging consumers to buy cheaper domestic goods. This instigates retaliation from other countries when they perceive trade barriers imposed on their exports to be unfair. Consistently implementing trade barriers between countries could lead to a trade war. An ongoing trade war which has escalated between the United States and China, which started in 2018, is a good example. The US has imposed tariffs of more than $360 billion worth of Chinese goods, and China has retaliated with tariffs of more than $110 billion worth of US products. The trade war started when US placed 25% duties on around $34 billion of imports from China after alleged unfair trading practices. In response to this trading tariff implemented by the US, China retaliated by imposing a 25% tariff on 405 goods originating from the US worth about $34 billion. This has since escalated into batches of trade tariffs between the US and China, which are set to solve in phases that are currently in progress. However, the end to this trade war is not near. Hostility between countries and the emergence of COVID-19 has increased tensions and worsened the already strained US-China ties. As seen in the US-China's example, trade wars cause relationship countries to sour, slight triggers to set off proactive actions from either party. The US has already blamed China for the early handling of the virus, causing thousands of deaths and millions of jobs lost in the US. Threats has also been made to the US to terminate phase 1 of the trade deal, sabotaging months of negotiation between the countries.
So our last point on how trade barriers can lead to trade war is on trade protectionism for infant industries. Trade protectionism can lead to nations taking reciprocal actions if trade protection policies are implemented. Trade protectionism is creating trade barriers with the goal of protecting the country's own economy and well-being from the risk of international trading, which will put foreign companies at a disadvantage. So for example, protectionist threats have been made by the US against China, and measures implemented include tariffs of 25% on 1,300 products imported from China, which has an import value equivalent to 50 billion USD. China then responded by imposing tariffs on exports from the US worth over 60 billion USD. So this shows that countries may retaliate as they will be unable to sell their goods in markets where they are originally good in order to counter other countries' actions, which causes damaged relationships. Our third and final point is how trade barriers can affect innocent countries. Trade barriers between two countries can implicate countries not involved. The free market enables production of goods using the theory of comparative advantage, and this helps economies to capitalize on economies of scale. So, global trading has made countries more commercially interdependent, where imposing trade barriers against the exports of one country could potentially disrupt the whole supply chain in the market. When trade wars occur between large economies, The developing economies are affected as we function in an interdependent economy. So for this example, we'll be going back to the US-China trade war, where sub-Saharan Africa, although not the target of the US tariffs, has been a victim to drops in commodity prices and local currencies. The African Development Bank experts have warned that trade tensions could cause a 2.5% reduction in GDP by 2021. US tariffs on China, combined with domestic and external pressures, slows down Chinese production and reduces China's demand for raw materials for Africa. It is estimated that diminished Chinese demand could reduce annual exports of 75 billion USD for Africa. So this shows that trade barriers set by the US have been destructive to Africa's economy, with African leaders expressing dismay towards the US and a decrease in US engagement, which further supports that trade barriers does damage relations with other countries.
In conclusion, the pointers we have brought up demonstrates how trade barriers damage relationships between countries. Implementing trade barriers usually culminates in a trade war, as it instigates retaliation from other countries. Trade wars between economic powers influence market sentiments and could turn the economy bearish. In today's interdependent economy, tariffs placed on countries have potentially disrupted the entire chain of supply goods, thus implicating countries not involved in a trade war. Conflict resolution between countries take a long time, and its trickling effect remains in the economy. Therefore, we should encourage free trading as it only allocates resources efficiently in the market. They also bring about exchange of culture and technological practices, facilitating a greater understanding of differences between nations and visioning a global utopia.